In 1790, the United States was a bankrupt country. It had just won a war it couldn't really afford. Its new federal government owed roughly $79 million it had no reliable way to pay back, and individual states were sitting on tens of millions more in their own war debt, each printing their own currency, each taxing trade with its neighbors like a foreign country. Investors in London and Amsterdam assumed, reasonably, that this new experiment would never make good on what it owed. 218 years later, in the fall of 2008, that same country's financial system was so large and so interconnected that when one investment bank in Manhattan collapsed, it nearly took down the entire global economy with it. That's the arc of this video. Not the wars, not the presidents, not the speeches. The actual machine underneath all of it, how a nation that started as a fragile debtor became the largest, richest, most productive economy in human history, and what it had to break, borrow, and reinvent along the way to get there. Start with the debt, because the first genuinely consequential economic decision the United States ever made was what to do about it. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, proposed something that sounds almost too simple to matter. The federal government would assume every state's war debt and pay all of it back in full at face value, funded by new federal taxes and bonds. Southern states that had already paid off much of their own debt hated this, since it meant they'd be taxed to cover the debts of states like Massachusetts that hadn't. Hamilton got it through anyway in 1790 by trading it for the location of the new national capital on the Potomac. Why does a 200-year-old bond swap matter to an economic history video? Because it worked exactly the way Hamilton designed it to. By honoring every debt completely instead of defaulting or negotiating it down, the new government proved to European and domestic investors, immediately and credibly, that American bonds were safe to hold. That credibility is what let Hamilton's next creation, the First Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, function as a real central bank, issuing a stable currency and providing credit to a country that genuinely didn't have any before. The lesson embedded in the country's very first major economic decision is one that shows up again and again for the next 2 centuries. American economic power was built less on any single resource or invention than on the state's ability to make credible financial commitments that let private capital take bigger risks than it otherwise would. That credit system needed something to actually finance, and the 19th century supplied it in almost embarrassing abundance: land, and lots of people willing to move on to it. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the country's size for roughly $15 million, a few cents an acre for some of the richest farmland on earth. The 1862 Homestead Act handed out an eventual total of around 270 million acres of public land, more than 10% of the entire area of the United States, to settlers willing to farm it, essentially manufacturing millions of small property owners with a direct financial stake in the country's growth. And the labor to work all that land, and later to staff the factories being built on top of it, arrived by the tens of millions through immigration, drawn by wages that, even at their worst, usually beat what was available back home. None of this was charity. It was the rawest possible version of the American economic formula: abundant land plus abundant labor plus a credible banking system equals an economy that could expand its output simply by adding more inputs, long before it had to get clever about how efficiently it used them. The tool that turned all that raw land and labor into an actual national market was the railroad, and it's worth being precise about how directly the government subsidized this. Congress's 1862 Pacific Railway Act didn't just permit a transcontinental line, it financed one, handing the companies building it millions of acres of land they could sell to settlers and investors to fund construction. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific crews met at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10th, 1869, and suddenly a trip that had taken months by wagon took about a week by rail. Track mileage tells the real story of what happened next, from roughly 45,000 miles of line in 1871 to about 215,000 miles by 1900, an explosion that historians consider the country's first genuinely big business, one that in turn created enormous new demand for steel, coal, timber, and glass, and gave every other industry for the first time a reliable way to reach a truly national market instead of just the nearest city. This is the mechanism, not the myth. Railroads didn't just move goods, they manufactured the first national market big enough to make mass production actually profitable. And mass production is exactly what showed up to fill that market at a speed and scale that startled the rest of the industrialized world. Andrew Carnegie adopted the Bessemer steel process and built vertically integrated steel mills that could outproduce British competitors who'd invented the technology first. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, formed as a trust in 1882, came to control, at its peak, something in the range of 90% of of American oil refining, achieved partly through genuinely superior efficiency and partly through pricing deals with railroads that quietly crushed smaller competitors. By 1901, when J.P. Morgan financed the merger that created United States Steel, buying out Carnegie for roughly $400 million, the new company was capitalized above $1 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in world history at a time when the entire federal budget ran a fraction of that. This is where the American economic model reveals its first serious internal contradiction. The same legal and financial freedom that let entrepreneurs build unprecedented efficiency also let them build unprecedented, largely unaccountable market power, and by the 1890s, a decade Americans at the time actually nicknamed the Great Depression. Before the far worse one 30 years later, the same trusts that had built modern industry were also strangling competition inside it. The 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act was Congress's answer, and while enforcement stayed weak for another 2 decades, it planted a principle that would keep resurfacing throughout American economic history. Unregulated markets could produce spectacular growth and spectacular concentrations of power at the same time, and eventually the government would be pulled in to referee between the two. Labor paid a direct, sometimes bloody price for that concentration of industrial power, and the clearest example is the Homestead Strike of 1892. Carnegie Steel's Homestead, Pennsylvania plant was at the time the largest manufacturing operation on Earth, and when the union contract came up for renewal, plant manager Henry Clay Frick, with Carnegie's backing, demanded a wage cut of roughly 20% and locked out all 3,800 workers rather than negotiate. When Frick brought in 300 armed Pinkerton guards by barge to protect strikebreakers, a gun battle broke out that left around a dozen people dead. The state militia was called in to reopen the plant. The strike collapsed within months. And the Amalgamated Association, which had represented roughly 24,000 skilled steelworkers nationally going into 1892, mostly limited to a handful of mills rather than the industry broadly, was gutted so thoroughly that organized steelworkers didn't win recognition again until the New Deal era, 4 decades later. Carnegie Steel's profits, meanwhile, rose more than 20-fold in the 9 years that followed. This is the other half of the Gilded Age efficiency story. The same vertical integration and cost discipline that let American steel outcompete the world was also achieved in no small part by making sure workers had no organized leverage to claim a larger share of what they were producing. The referee got a second, more permanent job in 1913, and this one exists specifically because American banking kept blowing up in ways private markets couldn't fix on their own. The panic of 1907 got bad enough that the crisis was effectively contained by one man, J.P. Morgan, personally locking bank presidents in his library until they agreed to backstop each other's failing institutions. Relying on the goodwill of one aging financier is not a monetary policy, and Congress responded with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating a central bank meant to act as a permanent, public lender of last resort, so a private panic never again had to be solved by a private banker's living room. It was meant to prevent exactly the kind of crisis that 16 years later it would instead help cause. Agriculture was running a strikingly similar boom through the same years, and it left a permanent environmental scar that the New Deal later had to spend real money cleaning up. Wartime demand for wheat during World War I, followed by continued high prices into the early 1920s, pushed farmers on the southern Great Plains to plow up millions of acres of native grassland that had never been farmed before. Land whose deep-rooted prairie grass was the only thing keeping its thin topsoil in place. When wheat prices collapsed in the late 1920s, farmers responded, rationally from their own individual standpoint, by plowing even more land to try to make up in volume what they'd lost in price. Exactly the kind of decision that makes sense for one farm and becomes disastrous when every farm in the region does it simultaneously. When a severe drought hit in 1931, there was no root system left to hold the soil, and the resulting Dust Bowl stripped topsoil off an estimated 100 million acres, forcing roughly 2.5 million people to abandon the region entirely over the following decade. It's a smaller, quieter version of the same lesson the rest of the economy kept learning the hard way. Individually rational decisions made without any coordinating mechanism, whether in farming, banking, or industry, could add up to a collective disaster that no single participant intended or could have stopped alone. Because by the late 1920s, the American economy had built something genuinely new and genuinely unstable underneath its own prosperity. Consumer credit exploded, allowing ordinary families to buy radios, refrigerators, and cars on installment plans they hadn't been able to afford in cash before. And on Wall Street, investors were buying stocks on margin, sometimes putting down as little as 10% of a stock's price and borrowing the rest, a bet that only works as long as prices keep rising. When they stopped in October 1929, the unwinding was ferocious, specifically because so much of the boom had been built on borrowed money rather than real underlying earnings growth. What turned a stock market crash into the Great Depression, though, wasn't the crash itself. It was the response, or the lack of one, from the very institution built in 1913 to prevent exactly this. The Federal Reserve, rather than flooding the banking system with liquidity, allowed the money supply to contract by roughly a third between 1929 and the early 1930s. A policy failure economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz would later identify as the single most important reason the downturn became a catastrophe rather than an ordinary recession. More than 9,000 banks failed between 1929 and 1933. Industrial production fell by nearly 47%. Unemployment hit around 25%. And when Congress, hoping to protect American jobs, passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, raising duties on thousands of imported goods, other countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, and American exports collapsed from roughly $5 billion in 1929 to about $1.5 billion by 1932, showing how a policy meant to shield domestic industry from foreign competition ended up shrinking the entire market that industry depended on. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, beginning in 1933, is usually remembered as a set of relief programs, but its lasting economic significance is structural. It permanently rewired the relationship between the federal government and the financial system. The FDIC, created in 1933, insured ordinary people's bank deposits so a rumor could no longer trigger the kind of self-fulfilling bank run that had wiped out thousands of institutions. The SEC, created in 1934, required public companies to actually disclose honest financial information instead of letting investors buy blind. Glass-Steagall separated ordinary commercial banking from riskier investment banking on the theory that a bank holding your savings shouldn't also be the one gambling with them. None of this ended the Depression on its own, and a premature push toward budget balancing in 1937 actually triggered a second sharp downturn, a mistake that reinforced just how fragile the recovery still was. What the New Deal did accomplish, durably, was building the plumbing, deposit insurance, securities regulation, a basic social safety net through Social Security in 1935 that has underpinned American financial stability imperfectly but persistently ever since. It took a full-scale war to actually finish the job the New Deal started. When the United States entered World War II, its factories didn't just supply its own military, they became the industrial engine for most of the Allied war effort simultaneously, an achievement historians still refer to, without much exaggeration, as the arsenal of democracy. American aircraft production went from under 3,000 planes in 1939 to roughly 300,000 by the end of the war. Shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels between 1941 and 1945, an average of nearly 3 completed every 2 days. Unemployment, still above 14% as late as 1940, effectively vanished as war production absorbed every available worker and then some, pulling millions of women into factory jobs for the first time. This is the uncomfortable, but economically honest point. It was the mobilization of total war, not the New Deal alone, that finally ended a decade of mass unemployment in America. A reminder that a government willing to spend and organize production at genuinely unlimited scale can move an economy in ways peacetime policy rarely dares to attempt. That wartime industrial base, still standing when every rival economy in Europe and Asia had been bombed into rubble, is the actual foundation of the post-war American boom. And the United States moved immediately to design a global financial system with itself at the center. Meeting at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, representatives from 44 countries agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. Every other currency in the system was, in effect, now measured against the United States. This wasn't charity either. It gave American exporters, lenders, and multinational corporations, companies like like Coca-Cola and General Motors that expanded aggressively overseas in the following decades, a uniquely stable and dominant position in global trade and finance precisely because the whole system was built around their home currency. At home, that same post-war era produced the most broadly shared prosperity in American history, and the mechanism behind it is worth naming plainly. For roughly 3 decades after the war, wages for typical workers rose in step with rising productivity, meaning that as workers and machines produced more per hour, ordinary paychecks grew correspondingly, not just corporate profits. The GI Bill helped send millions of veterans to college and helped millions more buy their first homes, seeding a suburban housing boom. Developments like Levittown, New York, built starting in 1947, which used a 27-step assembly line construction process that could turn out a finished house in a single day with a crew of 36 workers. That in turn created enormous demand for cars, appliances, and highways. The 1956 Interstate Highway Act funded the construction of tens of thousands of miles of roadway, further cementing the automobile and the industries built around it: steel, rubber, oil, at the center of the American economy. Union membership peaked at roughly a third of the American workforce in the 1950s, giving ordinary workers real bargaining leverage over their share of the country's rapidly growing output. This is the closest the American economy has come to a genuinely self-reinforcing engine. Rising productivity funded rising wages funded rising consumption, and rising consumption funded the very corporate profits that paid for the next round of investment and productivity gains. That engine started grinding against its own limits by the early 1970s, and the breakpoint arrived from 2 directions at once. On the currency side, the United States had been running persistent balance of payments deficits through the 1960s, partly to fund the Vietnam War and foreign aid, and foreign governments were accumulating more dollars than the American gold stock could plausibly back at $35 an ounce. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon simply suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold altogether, an announcement that effectively ended the Bretton Woods system Roosevelt-era planners had built. Then, in October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an oil embargo on the United States over its support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and the price of crude oil nearly quadrupled, from around $2.90 a barrel to $11.65 by January 1974. Gas lines stretched for blocks. The combination of a newly unanchored dollar and a sudden oil price shock produced something the post-war Keynesian playbook had no good answer for: stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment arriving together. A combination that was supposed to be economically impossible under the old models. It took a second oil shock from the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker's decision to push interest rates as high as 20% in 1981, deliberately triggering a severe recession that pushed unemployment to nearly 11%, to finally break the inflationary spiral. Inflation fell from close to 15% to around 3% by the mid-1980s. The Rust Belt, the steel towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the auto plants of Michigan, never fully recovered from that deliberate sacrifice, and American manufacturing employment, as a share of the total workforce, began a decline that has never reversed. Globalization deepened that same shift. The North American Free Trade Agreement, taking effect in 1994, and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, opened American consumers to a flood of cheaper imported goods and American corporations to enormous new markets and even cheaper offshore labor. Overall manufacturing employment fell by roughly 4.2 million jobs between 1994 and 2024. Though economists still actively debate how much of that decline traces specifically to trade rather than automation or other long-running trends across every wealthy country. The most cited academic estimate from economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson attributes something on the order of 1 to 2 million of those manufacturing job losses specifically to the surge of Chinese imports after 2001, concentrated overwhelmingly in a handful of hard-hit regions: the furniture towns of North Carolina, the textile textile counties of the South that never economically recovered even as the national economy as a whole kept growing. It's the same trade-off the country made with the railroads and the trusts a century earlier, playing out again in a new form. Cheaper goods and bigger corporate profits for the country as a whole, purchased in part with a concentrated, localized cost that fell almost entirely on specific towns and specific workers who had no say in the trade agreement that reshaped their local economy. What replaced manufacturing as the engine of American growth over the following decades was, increasingly, finance and technology, and the shift shows up clearly in where corporate profits and talent started concentrating. Deregulation loosened long-standing limits on banking and airlines through the late 1970s and 1980s. Silicon Valley, seeded originally by Cold War defense contracts, grew into a self-sustaining engine of venture-funded technology companies. And American multinational corporations increasingly generated their profits not from goods made and sold domestically, but from global operations and, eventually, global financial engineering. This shift produced real innovation and real wealth, but it also produced a financial system whose scale eventually outran the oversight built to contain it, culminating in 2008. The mechanics of the 2008 crisis are, underneath the jargon, a fairly simple story of a house price bet gone wrong at an almost unimaginable scale. Mortgage lenders, competing for volume in a rising housing market, extended loans, many of them subprime, to borrowers with weak credit and little documented ability to repay, then sold those mortgages into complex bundled securities that credit rating agencies, incentivized by the banks paying for the ratings, stamped as safe. When housing prices stopped rising and then fell, those securities turned out to be worth far less than advertised, and because major financial institutions across the world were holding them, the losses spread instantly and globally. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old investment bank, collapsed into bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, and its failure, rather than containing the panic the way regulators hoped, instead froze global credit markets almost overnight, since nobody could be sure which other institution might be next. Congress authorized a $700 billion bailout fund, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, to stabilize the banking system, and total household wealth losses in the United States eventually ran into the tens of trillions of dollars. The deepest lesson of 2008 isn't really about greedy bankers, satisfying as that story is. It's that the American financial system had, over 3 decades of deregulation and innovation, built itself into something so large, so interconnected, and so opaque that regulators didn't actually understand its risks until those risks were already detonating. An echo, 8 decades later, of the exact 1929 problem the New Deal had supposedly solved for good. So where does that leave the American economy today? By most measures, it remains the largest and most productive in the world, still home to the majority of the world's most valuable technology companies, still the issuer of the world's dominant reserve currency, still capable of the kind of rapid reinvention that turned a defense research project into the internet and turned Silicon Valley garages into trillion-dollar companies. But the same forces that built that power have also built durable structural strains that haven't been resolved so much as managed. Manufacturing communities that never recovered from deindustrialization, a level of income inequality that by most measures has returned to levels last seen before the Great Depression, and a financial sector still large enough and still central enough to the rest of the economy that its failures remain everyone's problem. The United States never became the world's dominant economy because of one law, one leader, or one invention. It became dominant because it kept building the same basic loop: credible credit, abundant resources, aggressive private enterprise, and a government willing to step in and rebuild the rules whenever the private version of that loop broke, and it has had to run that loop and rebuild it more times and at higher stakes than any economy in history has ever been asked to.